American and Indian English literature, though I am not very sure if we can complete Indian and American in one single day. So in that case, I will request the organizers later to see if Indian can be done on another particular separate day. But for today, let us do American and see how much we can understand the course. First of all, I'm given to understand. Yeah, am I audible now? Yeah, so I was just saying that going by the schedule, we are supposed to do Indian and American literature today. But I think when I was preparing my presentation, I thought it would be better if we can actually keep Indian on a separate day. I'll talk to the organizers later after this presentation. But for today, let's look at American literature and try to understand how what are the real concepts that bother us when we talk about American literature as such, American English literature as such. One very important thing that I think I should mention before we start with the presentation is that JNUEE is having MCQs these days. So, of course, a lot of effort goes to memorize a lot of things. But at the same point of time, it is important for us to understand the concepts. Now, why is conceptual understanding important? It is important because when we are facing MCQs, of course, we won't know everything. It is not possible to know everything. The same applies for net examination as well. So how do we tackle questions which where we do not really know the answer to it? In that case, elimination is a very good procedure. Most of the times there are two choices which are anyway they're not very valid. So when we are building concepts, when we are trying to understand the kind of writings that emerge from each writer, at a certain period of time, be it American literature or British literature or Irish literature, that will actually suffice us and also aid us in a particular way to understand what are the particular kind of writings that a particular writer can write and what probably he might not write. So that way guesswork also helps in a long way. Anyway, I'll start presenting my PowerPoint presentation. uh, just let me know once it is visible. Yeah, so is it visible now? Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm putting the slideshow mode on, and yeah, we'll talk about uh, the history of American literature. First of all, it's important for us to understand what America is. Of course, I mean, going by today's understanding, it is it is a hub, it is a power center in the world. It has a particular political milieu. It has a capitalist neoliberal understanding, and that is a debatable political point, which we are not going into right now. What is important for us to understand is that America was a colony of the British when it was founded. America was not a plain land. It was a colony where there were Native Americans who used to live. They also suffered genocide, as most other, Australia, for example, Australian Aborigines, they suffered the same fate in the hands of the British colonizers, though Australia was a penal colony. But for America, America came with a sort of dream in the minds of people. What kind of dreams came in the minds of people? First of all, the people who actually colonized America were British, but they were of a certain religion. They followed a certain religion. What religion did they follow? They followed Puritanism. Now, Puritanism, if we know British literature, we will know that there was a phase called the Reformation, a kind of, right after the Elizabethan age, throughout the Elizabethan age. We find Protestantism gaining steam. There is a more radical understanding of Protestantism. It's a breakaway faction from Protestantism as such, which is called as Puritanism. Now, Puritanism it is a personal sort of religion. It is not as established as Catholicism is, the idea of bishop and archbishop and abbot. Those are not present as such. The idea is of that of congregation, a society taking care of itself by a group of people called the elect, right? So elect were the people who actually they played the role of the clergy in in puritanical religious understanding. Now, what happens over there? These Puritans, they leave England due to persecution, both from the Catholics and, of course, a little from the Protestants as well. They go and explore America. They colonize America with a certain dream of the promised land. Now, those of us who know biblical allusions, will know that the idea of promised land is it is almost like God, kind of believing in his word, he actually giving us some kind of an oracle that there is a land which will be for you to follow your faith. So the dimension, the founding dimension of America was not at all secular. It was completely religious. It was based on hardline thought to a certain extent, of course. But what is remarkable about America is that America was founded in the 17th century, something around 1620, and today we are like 400, 500 years away from that. And today, look at how America has changed. I mean, religion does play a factor, but not as much as it was supposed to. If we go by the founding history of the American land, how better to start our presentation but by citing Benjamin Franklin. Of course, he was a statesman. He was a primary founding father of America, United States, and he was also the sixth president of the state of Pennsylvania. Uh, he actually talks about America, and we'll just try to look at his quote and try to understand what America meant. He says, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." Now, what does the statement actually talk about? The statement talks that we are finding a new land, we are establishing a colony in a new land where we are not only having dreams, but we are also having insecurity. Now, anything that is new, even in kind of geographical exploration or disciplinary exploration, we know that it comes with a set of, let's say, hope, with a set of fear, with a set of anxiety. Will we be able to succeed? It's the same thing that we face when we are actually exploring something new, taking up a new course, joining a new class. The same kind of emotions that kind of run through our mind and body. So that becomes a very important, let's say, founding emotion of America. It's not about only hope of the promised land. It is also about how human beings establish that particular colony and how they run to the understanding of it. How do they look at America? How does America establish itself as a future? A religious future, later a democratic future. How does that kind of play out? Again, we have someone called John Smith. Now, John Smith is again a very important writer of that particular era, and I'm referring to the let's say the 17th century, the early 17th century, 1610, 1620s. If I'm not wrong, John Smith is writing somewhere around 1619, 1620, after America being founded, or let's say discovered. He says the country is not mountainous, not yet low, but such pleasant plain hills and fertile valleys, one prettily crossing the other, and watered so conveniently with sweet brook and crystal springs, as if art itself had devised them, a plain wilderness as God first made it. This is an exact quote from a book called A Map of Virginia, which has been written by John Smith. What we have to understand over here is that what are the impulses that accompany a writer or an explorer? Of course, John Smith also plays the role of an explorer. He was a governor of a particular province, I think Virginia, of course, yeah, Map of Virginia. So at that point of time, we are not only looking at subjective emotions. Look at the descriptions of that particular continent. He's talking about hills. He's talking about plains. He's talking about rivers. So there is an objective categorization, or let's say a cataloging of the topographical, discovery. So, I mean, if you know British literature or any kind of, I mean, literature for as such, any kind of world literature, you will always know that literature stems from objective poetry, objective thought process, and slowly moves into, let's say lyrical or more subjective emotions. The same thing for, I think, the, let's say, the Greek and Roman literature as such. We start with the epic and then we proceed towards the lyric. The same thing happens over here is that. So what we're trying to look at is a continent which has fertile lands, which has hills, the topographical explorations, which will also help those colonizers to communicate not only with the technological or engineering details of how to settle with a colony, but also to understand what subjective expectations can be kept from that particular land. Because of course, we know geography, ecology, all of them are interrelated with, let's say, emotions, hopes, and despairs, everything of that. Captain John Smith, his time frame is 1580 to 1631, English adventurer who chronicled commercial venture, who founded the first viable settlement in American colonies in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. He founded it in 1607. He's writing something around 1619, 1620. Objective description of American lands. There is an element of cataloging, as I said. There is a comparison to Eden, Garden of Eden, a complete, biblical reference. So I was talking about Bible, right? The Promised Land. Now you get it. There's a comparison to the Garden of Eden. Another thing which is very important for us to remember over here, it has an anti-colonial aspect to it as well. It has been inhabited by the savages. So to say that there was no population present in America when it was discovered would be definitely a misnomer. That would be a problematic statement. We have population who are already inhabiting America by that time. They were called the savages. Now this particular noun is very important. Look at the way the other figure. I mean, those of us who know a little bit about post-colonial literature will know that there is a process of othering, the self and the other. Who comes in my team and who is different from me? That kind of differential politics. I mean, I'm sure when we'll talk about deconstruction and post-colonial identity, we'll look more into it. But there is an element of the savages, people who are not civilized. So that is also, that comes along with the politics of negation, a politics of non-recognizing people. The same thing happens in Australia as well. Australia had been called a terra nullius, that there were no people on the land, which is again a misnomer. So this is important for us to understand how a colonizing mentality helps not only in America but in different cases. But for America, it's important because we will see how hope and despair plays along together. Moving to the next slide. It's called the New Worlds. Of course, Columbus, his discovery comes in the year 1492. He actually writes a detailed report to Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, this is important for us to understand. The discovery was done mostly by Spanish help, but of course, as we know, Britain, it excelled in colonial rivalry, and it almost conquered lands. Almost, I think, 60 to 65% of the global map was conquered by Britain at a point of time. The same thing happens in America. We find Columbus, a Spanish, let's say, an ambassador, an explorer, who actually he reports a huge kind of document to Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, and he talks about America, the New World. It was called the New World at that point of time. He talks about the field of discovery. He talks about objective planes, the same thing that James Smith was talking about. The same kind of language can be founded. Another thing which is important over here is that the discovery was always paralleled by European language. Now, when we talk about literary theory and criticism, it will be easier for us to understand why language plays a central, point in literature or any kind of recognizing process. Unless and until something is brought into the field of comprehension or cognition, expression doesn't come along. So the moment you express something, just think it in very simple terms. The moment you express something, it is already a part, it constitutes a part within the field of your cognition process. The same thing is happening. And we work through, let's say, mental models. That's an easy way to see. Let's think in this way. When we see a new thing, we always try to, juxtapose it with something which we already know. The same thing happens here. They're juxtaposing it to European language, to the European continent, and trying to understand what is new in America that makes it the promised land. Even for people who are Spanish colonizers, for them it was, of course, a new discovery, no doubt. The Puritan mission that I talked about, there is a sense of alienation. As I said, for every single discovery that we make, there is not only, let's say, an emotion of hope and an emotion of doing something great, aspirations. There is also, an emotion of alienation in tandem running along with it. Why is it alienation? You are leaving your native land, which is Britain in this case, and you are settling in a new land. There is homesickness. There is always a fear of the, let's say, the kind of diseases that might actually come along, ecological imbalances, floods, famines, all of that. At the same point of time, America was being so-called, quote-unquote, controversial term, civilized by the colonizers at that point of time. So that is also very important for us to understand that the civilizing process as such was not bereft of, let's say, on one hand, exterminating people who already resided there, the savages, and also at the same point, having the processes of the emotions of fear and hope running together. So that alienation also becomes central to American literature. That we will discuss when we go to the next slides. There is a declaration of intention, and the declaration of intention, as Benjamin Franklin rightly said, that it is about making a new colony. Either we stick together or we die. The same thing. There is an intention to make America the promised land. There is this Puritan idea of consensus. I was talking about the idea of congregation that actually runs around Puritan religious thought. There is a body of elders who are the elect, who actually run, let's say, religious and political structures at that point of time. So consensus becomes a very important role, it plays a very important role in America when it was being established. That is something which you need to remember. Why? We will come later to those slides. Against pre-deformation, of course, Catholic people infallibility, of course, the Catholic doctrine was being punctured both by the Protestant idea and the, let's say, the Puritan idea, and in Britain by the Anglican idea as well. We have a very famous sermon at, I think it comes around in 1630, which is called John Winthrop's sermon. So there is a a clergyman called John Winthrop who actually settled in in I think Virginia, I think in United States of America in Virginia, and he actually detailed out a model code of conduct as such, how to behave as a Christian on in an unknown land. Of course, he doesn't make references to the savages, except saying that the savages are people who do not deserve to be included into the Christian faith unless and until they're willing to convert. So that is again one thing that we can look later. But basically, what I'm trying to imply is that American foundation was always a religious foundation. That is something which you can keep in mind. Again, William Bradford, he was the first governor of Plymouth colony. First landing of Pilgrim Providence was made visible. God was acting in time. The same references that this is the new world gifted by God. We are all pilgrims who are here to kind of realize and materialize God's dream. Things like that. Next, 1630 Puritan Society in Massachusetts, the idea of the elect. I've already discussed this, so I'm not going into detail. Yeah. Now, why was he discussing this religious idea? Of course, we know that a society functions parallelly with legal terms, with societal norms, conventions, and that is best reflected in literature through the medium of culture. Now, what we find over here is that there is a poetess, a very, very, a very, very early poetess by the name of Anne Bradstreet. She writes something like Upon the Burning of the House, where she actually talks against this puritanical order. She says that this puritanical order, which talks about self-reliance and self-discipline, actually culls out all kinds of independence, independence of mind and spirit. You have to adhere to their notions of what is right and what is wrong, or you get acted against. So that is the point that you have to understand. So the very first literature that comes out, I mean, prominent literature that comes out from America is a religious literature, and notably a literature that comes out from America is a poem. I mean, if you can appreciate the poem, a poetic fiction for that matter. Yeah. So decent in the works of John Cotton, as he was a colonial minister, and he was actually writing treatises along with someone called Anne Hutchinson. I'm sure you know John Cotton as well, and both of them were actually writing against this this puritanical understanding of what discipline is, what purity is. I mean, I think we can understand living in an Indian society as well. There are people who will tell us what is discipline, what is human purity, what is wrong and what is right in that way. The same thing was playing out in America in a more strict, let's say, conservative way. And we find there is dissent that is coming out in the first, let's say, first examples or instances of literature. Uh, Both, Anne Bradstreet, John Cotton, Anne Hutchinson, all of them were stressing on individual conviction. They were saying that we need a kind of religion or a system of faith which talks about individual choices, individual conviction. Very topical even today's day, especially in India. So you understand this very well. This idea of individual conviction was right there in the 1630s in America. Let's say that was a kind of a proto-independent way of looking at life that was already present. Person, Roger Williams, is an antinomian. He established something called the Rhode Islands. I think most of us know where Rhode Islands lie in the United States. And he establishes a society called the Quaker Group. Now, who is an antinomian? An antinomian is a kind of an agnostic. He believes in faith, but he also tries to look at the contradictions that faith, kind of gives you along. There are certain things which are really positive about every religion, about every faith, a system of faith. There are certain things which are completely, that is very ritualistic and goes against the idea of independence. So Roger Williams was an antinomian who was trying to weigh the scales of what faith really meant. He established a group called the Quaker Group. A Quaker group is again a religious group, a semi-religious group, which talks about how human independence can be matched with the idea of religion. So you are talking about a religion which is ritualistic, which talks about discipline, which talks about purity, but you are also looking at the idea of human independence. So you can modify religion in a certain way. It's a more liberal version of religion. That was the Quaker group in 1636. Again, there was someone called Solomon Stott who wanted to baptize the savages and include them as part of the American civilization. Right. Another very important historical moment that we have to keep in mind, because this particular event also, resonates throughout American literature in bits and parts, which is the Salem witch trials. I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but Salem witch trials actually talks about an event where there were women, or there were even men, who did not adhere to certain religious principles, who showed quote unquote suspicious behavior, they were actually ordealed, or they were sent for an ordeal, a trial, a kind of a courtly session, where they were judged if they were actually practicing witchcraft or not. So any kind of divine behavior was actually equated with the idea of witchcraft. And I think some around 14, 15 women were executed, and some 5 men were executed in the year 1692 itself. Um, and the colonial mission, as I was talking about, was again furthered by someone called Cotton Mather. He writes Magnalia Christi Americana. It talks about the savages and the American intent to civilize, the same thing. You have someone called Jonathan Edwards, who talks about the great Christian doctrine of original sin defended. Now, when we have a sort of rebellion, a kind of liberalism that is coming out in the religious, that's the milieu of America, we also have a conservative section which kind of reacts to it, a reactionary force. In that way, we have someone called Jonathan Edwards, who was defending the idea of a established religion as against something like the Quaker society was trying to imagine. He also wrote something like The Nature of True Virtue, which again talked about Christian faith. There was something called Treatise Concerning Religious Affections, the same thing, defending religion and discipline as against human liberty and individualism. Um, Benjamin Franklin, who actually I quoted first, he is a secular. He talks about individualist thought. In Benjamin Franklin's word, religion does not actually play a very vital role. To him, even if New World was a religious, was an outcome of a religious function, it was more important to see how we make it a paradise. Okay, so for him, secularism, I mean, the way we understand today, probably not that wide, but secularism, no doubt, played a very important role for America, an inclusive culture. We don't know how inclusive it was, if it was actually kind of laid out to the savages, so-called savages as well. But he actually talks about individualist thought. He talks about individualist action. He talks about enterprising mind. He was an enterpriser in a way. Of course, he writes his autobiography in the year 1771, which talks a lot about individual action and America's need to come out of the colonial yoke. Remember that America was actually going towards its independence in 1776, of course, and his autobiography comes right 5 years before America got its independence. So you know how important the individual, let's say independence. It mattered not only on an individual ground but also on a political anti-colonial ground. So that also comes along. He was also a man who talks about reason. I think those of you who have attended British classes, I'm sure you people have been taught, or you people have discussed the idea of reason in continental Enlightenment thought. Reason becomes a very important point for Benjamin Franklin. For him, blind faith does not work to make a land a paradise. For him, what is important is rationalizing things. And I'm not the intricacies of what reason means, but more or less we understand a commonsensical point of view. Right. Then we have Thomas Jefferson. Again, he is a president, and he's also a statesman in a way. He talks about notes on the state of Virginia. He talks 1784, which is after America's independence. Observable facts, tradition of John Smith. He kind of talks about he kind of discusses the cataloging enterprise, the cataloging intent of what America contained, what promise American lands could have in them. The same tradition that John Smith was writing in. Someone called Robert Beverly, he writes History and Present State of Virginia, again, almost in an objective point of view. Very little subjectivity can be looked into it. Jefferson belonged of course, in the common sense tradition. I was talking about common sense, the idea of reason. The idea of reason and common sense comes parallelly, and it talks about an individualist notion of life, of course. So common sense also becomes a very important part in their writings, and all of these are artworks of non-fiction, by the way. He refers to Thomas Paine. I think most of us know who Thomas Paine is if we read British literature. Thomas Paine, or he, and I think even there's another writer, I forgot, but I'll just talk about him if I remember his name. Thomas Paine actually talks about common sense. He has a treatise called The Common Sense, and he talks about how political establishment and how belief systems always have to be counterchecked by the idea of individualist notion and a sense of reason. So the same thing actually runs in America at that point of time. Now, one thing that we can remember is that this is not an exception in case of America. At that point of time, the entire continent of Europe was also going through the movement called Enlightenment. After Newton discovered arithmetic and the idea of gravity and all of that came into being, we see that the idea of reason actually plays out in the continent and in Britain as much as in America. So in a way, it was a direct import. The idea was a direct import from the continent of Europe. Of course, I mentioned Newtonian science and Enlightenment. Continental Enlightenment and its influences. David Hume, again a British writer, Scottish writer also. I mean, he writes something called Theatres of Human Nature. How human beings look at possible associations between thought and action, sensation and sensuality, everything as such. The idea of empiricism also comes into being when we are talking about the idea of reason and sciences. So the same thing was actually talked about in America as well. A direct continental influence again. 1782, Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, if I'm pronouncing him right, he writes letters from an American farmer where he actually quotes the American spirit. The American spirit becomes very important for us. He writes something talking about the American spirit, and he says the American spirit is one where the most perfect society, it is one of the most perfect societies that exist in the world. That is what he's trying to say. For him, again, the idea of idealism in America, a promised land that comes along with the dream of an American farmer. And he actually identifies himself with an American farmer, by the way. He was not a politician. I think he was in some kind of religious function as well. I don't remember exactly what designation he held. But again, this idea of lowly life in America, being a farmer, being a worker, that was being actually extolled at the very primary, let's say, foundation of America. American dream and paradisical experiences, undertones, ellipses. As I said, why am I talking about undertones? When we're talking about American dream, we're also talking about the fear of not being able to succeed. So there is an undertone, there are undercuttings, there are ellipses, all running parallelly in the American dream. There is an emulation of British models. This is very important for us to understand. Not only in terms of idea or ideology, as I talked about the Enlightenment, there is also emulation of British literary models as such. Of course, America cannot invent its own writings as such, but it is actually being influenced not only by the continent, but mostly by the British model of literature. Abstract rhetorical language, there is an inward sense of exploration, which it comes a little later. I mean, just after this these slew of non-fiction writings come to an end almost towards the end of the 18th century, we find more kind of subjectivity being grounded in American literature as such. There is an excessive rhetorical language. Now, most of us who are actually reading psychology will know that rhetorical language are used not only to kind of, let's say, with a sense of embellishment, but it is also used with a sense where content matters less than the form, right? So when he's talking about rhetorical language, to him, it is the American dream, the kind of bubble that he's trying to, I mean, these writers are talking about, that becomes much more sacrosanct than the reality. So when we're actually, talking about rhetorical language, a kind of idealism, a notion of idealism plays through or through their, of course, their imagination. That is precisely because there are some writers who are such optimists that they're not willing to think about what are the risks that can come along in the American dream, but they want to, carry forward the dream towards, let's say, a kind of an idealistic paradise. And for that, rhetoric becomes the right medium of expression, the right medium of promise that something new can come. It concerns with failure that runs parallelly with the American dream. There is quest for true democracy. Now, the idea of democracy that, of course, come into being after America got its independence in the year 1776. But we also find that French Revolution was drawing near 1789. So, of course, in the entire continent was shaken by the French Revolution. The French Revolution itself is the most significant political movement in modern global history as such. So there is this American dream of true democracy, the idea of true democracy against religion, a more secular function that comes into being. There is a rapid secular impulse in literature that contained echoes of the promised land that I was talking about. Now, the first most significant writer that I talk about he is named Fenimore Cooper. He has a series of novels called the Leather Stocking novels. I'm not going into the detailing of each plot. I think that is really banal. You can just look it up, or probably you can read it by yourself. But I'm going to discuss what these plots contain more or less, so that we have a conception when we are dealing with these kind of texts. What is important for us over here is to remember the dates, of course. I mean, for MCQ, your date is very important. I've given the dates of publication, but what is more important for us to understand is these novels, they actually talk not only about the expansion of the American colony into the, let's say, the northern frontiers. They were called the northern frontiers, more precisely the northwestern frontiers. So if you look at the map of America, you will see that America was being colonized towards the eastern part of it, right in the beginning. But then slowly there was a westward expansion. So over there, when the westward expansion is taking place, what we find? Not only find plain lands and mountains, we also find forests. So forest becomes a very totemic, let's say, a trope in the plot of all these five novels. If you go through these five novels, you will see forest plays a very, very important role. And not only forest, we have direct mentions of the Native Americans. Of course, we understand that the idea of savages now has been modified to kind of, let's say, to include them as Native Americans. In all these five novels, you will find mention of Native Americans, their lifestyles. There is a confrontation of the Western culture, let's say the colonial culture, and the native culture of America in all these five novels. And what you will find is that jungle, not only forest and jungle plays a very vital role. The idea of human agency, the colonial people shooting Native Americans, the Native Americans again attacking them, a moment of reconcilement. All these played together in these, let's say, five texts. So what we really find here is that the idea of adventure that becomes central to the, let's say, to the understanding of all these five novels. The idea of expansion, the idea of fear of death, of meeting accidents. I mean, kind of meeting inadvertent situations. All of that, all of these play parallelly in these five novels. You can just remember the five novels in sequence for your MCQ. But there is a pretty common character in all these five novels. He is probably the protagonist in a way, though. I mean, the author does not really put a protagonist figure like that, like in a very obvious way. He's called Natty Bumppo. Now that might be important for your MCQ. And he was perhaps inspired by a colonial adventurist called Daniel Boone. There was someone called Daniel Boone who was actually an explorer in the northwestern frontier. Probably Natty Bumppo had been inspired by this particular character, and we find that this is a particular character who actually brings in the moment of reconcilement between the Western colonized notion of, let's say, human civilization and the Native American culture. So Daniel Boone becomes important. Again, what is important for us to remember conceptually here is that Fenimore Cooper, as a writer, is admitting the presence of Native Americans and also is looking into the moments of reconcilement. So in the literary milieu, we find a moment of reconcilement, of coexistence, actually playing out in the American dream. So that is a very, very significant development. Another thing is that all these five novels, they were more or less they were published in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, a little earlier than that, 1823 onwards. We find that all these are historical novels in a sense. I won't really say historical novels, but they have a historical milieu. Conjecture says is that Fenimore Cooper was a fan of Walter Scott, and people who have read British literature or have looked into Scottish literature will know that Walter Scott plays a very, very important role in introducing the concept of the historical novel in literature. So the same thing we find almost, I won't say an exact aping or emulation process, but almost a kind of an echo or a resonance playing out in these five novels to that which Walter Scott did. One thing you have to remember is that though these novels were being published in the 19th century, all of them actually look back on retrospect towards the mid 18th century, 1740, 1757. The other three novels also deal with, I think, time which runs in the mid 1750s or 1760s, something like that. So there was a retrospective point of view. This becomes also very important for us in the American understanding of literature. Retrospection, inward exploration, that becomes very important. Why? Now, why do we retrospect? When we are actually on an adventure, when we are looking back, we try to understand what we have done to the land that we thought about as a promised land. So this constant self-evaluation, this constant looking back towards history, that plays a very important role in Fenimore Cooper's novels, Caesar Stocking novels. So for an MCQ, to be precise, you have to remember the names of the novels, the dates of publication, probably the fact that they were all plotted in the 18th century, and the fact that it has an element of adventure. There is a character called Natty Bumppo, there is forest, and also there is this idea of reconcilement that is playing. If you get a more cultural question, probably this will be important for us to understand later. Right. Next, we move towards Emerson. I have followed a chronological order, but the exact dates we can find out. I mean, Emerson also comes just after Fenimore Cooper. Emerson, I mean, it's again in the mid 19th century, of course. Emerson is a very important figure for us because he's writing in the mid 19th century. And if you go back to British literature, you'll remember that the early part of the 19th century was dominated by a movement, a literary movement called the Romantic movement. For Emerson, the movement is not called Romanticism. It was not called Romanticism. It was definitely influenced by the idea of Romanticism. but it was also influenced by other movements like German idealism. German idealism, in fact, ran parallelly with Romanticism. Germany was, going through an ideal, after Immanuel Kant, if you know him, after this movement of German idealism took kind of prominence. The idea of form, abstract thought, of nature, of beauty, that kind of influenced Romanticism in Britain, and in America we have both these trends, kind of running parallelly. There is this idea of romance towards nature. There is this idea of, let's say, a platonic eidetic form. Most of us know that Plato talks about ideals. Plato is an idealist philosopher. The same thing runs in Emerson as well. He says that there is one single truth. There is one single moment of light where we can actually go back and understand what truth means, and that is only in the times of infancy. Can we hear the echo of Wordsworth? I think we can. I mean, when we talk about Wordsworth and his preludes and things like that, the same thing comes along. He talks about his joyish pleasure as a boy, Tintin away, that sort of thing actually plays over here as well. He says infancy is the perpetual messiah. There is not only a romanticism towards nature, there is also an element of self-exploration and this belief that there is one formless truth, which is in the Platonic tradition, more developed by the movement called German idealism. You can look up what German idealism is. This particular movement in America, which was a compilation of both Romanticism and German idealism, was called Transcendentalism. Now, most of us who know what etymologically the idea of transcendence means something which goes beyond immanence, something that actually goes beyond the living moment, the time and the space that we live in. So the idea of transcendentalism is completely, let's say, is kind of, it is associated with the idea of a greater truth that is not found in this world. There is a truth which we need to find, but which is always alloyed, impure in this world, which Plato talks about, the supreme form. So transcendental echoes is there in Emerson. We have his first treatise called Nature coming out in 1836. Of course, we can guess that it is a romantic in the sense naturally romantic, that kind of a treatise where he talks about returning back to nature. The same thing that Rousseau talks about before French Revolution, the same thing that Britain adopts, let's say 2 decades later, the same thing comes to America, another 1 decade and a half later, 1836, Nature. He talks about man and spirit. There is an essay called Man and Spirit. I think Nature is the name of the book. Well, the books are in italics, by the way, and whatever I've quoted in the let's say the inverted commas, I'll just mention. The Man and Spirit essay, by the way. Over there, he talks about how human beings can connect to the Supreme Spirit. A bit of divine mysticism is, of course, associated with it, but nevertheless, you get the idea of transcendence. Next comes a very, very important essay called The American Scholar, which is strikingly Wordsworthian. It's about an American scholar who does not live only in universities. People like us who are actually looking forward towards higher education, for us, probably the responsibility, according to Emerson, is not only to become a scholar in the confines of a university, but also to play our role in, let's say, in society, to be, that generous enough. So an American scholar is not an elitist. An American scholar is someone who actually humbles himself down to any kind of profession, be it that of a farmer, of any kind of worker, an industrial laborer, anything. But American scholar has to have brains and also has to have the intent to work. So physical labor is not looked down upon. This is important. Someone can connect this to Marxism in a very, very faint echo, but American scholar does talk about, let's say, a leveling process of the mind and the body. There is something called the Divinity School Address that comes out in the 1837, again an essay. Divinity School Address actually kind of continues the mood of the American scholar. It was enunciated, delivered in a school called the Divinity School. And he talks about how mysticism is not an abstract concept. It is definitely related to the idea of making human lives better. So you can see that when we talk about idealism and, let's say, materialism, we have very, very, we talk about a dichotomy, an emerging dichotomy always. This is not present over here. In the Divinity School Address, we find that both brain and body comes together. There is no elitism which is at play. The next essay is on experience. He says that what is important in life to learn is from your experiences. The same thought that British Romanticism talks about, that experience becomes central for us to understand how human lives evolve. All answers lie in going back to nature. The same thing in experience. Self-reliance. This becomes a very, very important treatise because Right from the independence of America, foundation of America, in fact, we find self-reliance becomes a thematic concept, a recurring concept in the American dream as such. 1844. The oversoul is a soul that, I mean, again, an essay that doesn't only talk about engagement of an individual in the, let's say, in a university or in its own professional field of life, but also looking towards a sort of transcendence, a sort of spiritual enrichment, a sort of engaging with society through spirit and not only through, let's say, an objectifying, an aesthetic distance, not that, but actually being one with the society and also dreaming beyond. So that is the concept of the oversoul. And then we have the idea of the poet. Again, this is important for us to remember that when the poet was being written by Emerson, in Britain we had the Victorian age, which was setting in 1832, the emergence of the Victorian age. We find that when the poet was being written, the Victorian age had already started. It was more than a decade. And poets were actually called prophets in the Victorian era in Britain. The same thing plays over here is that he says that a poet is a man who has the capacity to look at forms, has the capacity to empathize with human society, and also kind of look beyond for a spiritual resurgence. So a poet becomes a very totemic figure in American literature, let's say in the mid 19th century. Infinitude of the private man. One thing is important, might be a little contrarian to understand that there is a constant notion of engaging with society, but there is always another notion of being private in a way. So you engage with society, you help people, but you also, kind of have time for yourself so that you can ponder over the greater mysteries of life. A kind of romanticism we can understand. Romanticism has individualist dimension as well, so we can understand that well. So an infinitude of private man plays along. By the way, Emerson was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1857, and American Philosophical Society, in fact, was in charge of generating more, let's say, not only generating but encouraging more literary activities and scientific activities at that point of time. So we understand that Emerson was a scholar of repute. That is why he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. For your MCQ, that might be a question, so we can remember that. Right. I'm going to the next slide. Nathaniel Hawthorne, he becomes the next prominent writer of the era. Herman Melville, we'll talk about him as well later. He calls him as deep as Dante. Of course, we know Dante, the Italian classical writer. But Melville believes Hawthorne was as, he was as in depth or as, let's say, rigorous as Dante was in his writing. Hawthorne associated himself with dark romanticism. Again, I talked about the romantic era kind of influencing American literature over here. So there is an element of dark romanticism in him. Now, what is dark romanticism? Dark romanticism is not only looking at nature, but also looking at mysteries of nature which remain unsolved, which is supposed to not only give you sensual pleasure, but thrill and fear. For example, we can understand that when we look at a fine blue sky and a green lush, a lush green land, there is one kind of sensual pleasure that we get. But when we look at a storm, a tornado, a turbulence, that is again another form of romanticism, right? When we enjoy a storm, let's say the thunderstorms that North India sees in April and May. So that kind of storm that has a destructive effect, that is also romanticized in him. For that, kind of invites the feelings of fear and, let's say, anger, the fear of anxiety, all that. So dark romanticism is all about that. There is a romantic trait, but that is more to do with the negative aspects of emotion. He's a novelist. He also writes short stories. His ancestors included John Hawthorne, who was in fact the only judge of the Salem trials who never repented his involvement. I already talked about Salem trials and the presence of witchcraft, and we see that his own ancestor was a judge, in fact, in those trials, who never gave a formal apology. Right. He was also elected to the Phi Beta Kappa Society, which was the a society which talks about the oldest academic honor in the United States. It was founded in 1776, the year of its independence. I'm just mapping this out because these might be important for your MCQ. So yeah, his first novel is called Fanshawe. Though he did not accept it publicly, he accepted it only much later because he thought that the status of his writing was not as good as his later novel. So his first published novel is called Fanshawe. Again, an MCQ question. 1837, we find his most prominent short story collection coming into place, Twice Told Tales. Very famous for Nathaniel Hawthorne. It comes out in 2 volumes. This is important for us to note. The name of the collection is derived from Shakespeare's King John, Act 3, Scene 4. Also, if you read through Homer's Odyssey, the last 3-4 lines, you will find that there is something which is being talked about life. There is something which is talked about life having different tales, at least being twice told. So the same spirit is being actually taken up by Nathaniel Hawthorne. He talks about how in all these short stories, if you look through the short stories, you will feel that life is not about just being, it is also about becoming. It's not about just coming into existence, it's also about what you do with your life. So the same spirit is there in Nathaniel Hawthorne's let's say short stories. His stories, the famous stories which you might look up and you might memorize, is called The Grey Champion, The Wedding Knell, The Minister's Black Veil, The Maypole of Marymount, The Great Carbuncle, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, The Haunted Mind, The Ambitious Great. Mostly all of these somehow deal with human mind and its complexities and relates it with the idea of nature. So there is an element of scientific invention that was taking place throughout the continent of Europe and in America, slowly and gradually. But there was a human mind which was looking not only towards that scientific experimentation, but also towards nature and its mysteries, and was trying to kind of understand the deeper psychologies of human mind. Now, how is human mind and nature related? Of course, whatever environmental condition we are put into, we are conditioned into, that plays a very important role in our psychological functioning. So there he's trying to kind of explore what human mind contains, the kind of dark fear, dark emotions like fear, anxiety, anger, even let's say the urge to kill, to murder, existential crisis. All of that comes into play in all these short stories, more or less. So you can just look up these short stories if you want, but the thematic background is that of fear and anxiety. There is an essay called Moses from an Old Man's, a wonder book for girls and boys, The Snow Image, Tanglewood Tales. All of these, I mean, Tanglewood Tales is, of course, it is a short story, but the others are essays, and what they talk about generally is about how to write in a romantic strain of thought. So he is actually indulging in non-fiction writing as well. He's talking about how a writer who is actually following the romantic strain of thought can kind of yoke together or kind of combine together the ideas of the mind and the sensual feelings of the body. Moses from an Old Man's also talks about how dark romanticism can be a literary trope for American writing. His important novels include The Scarlet Letter. I think many of us know it. It's one of the most famous novels that he has ever written. It talks about, it has an allusion to the Salem trials as well. Very, very famous, novels for such. The House of the Seven Givers, again, it has a very, very supernatural thrill. The Blithedale Romance, The Marble Fawn. More or less, all of these particular novels, they deal with human mind, its functioning, but also with societal responses to it. For example, in the Scarlet Letter, there is representation of the clergy. There is representation of witch trial. I mean, who is a witch and who is not. So there are responses not only by individual characters to their own fears and emotions. I mean, fear and anger and those kind of emotions, but also how society plays a very vital role in conditioning us into that environment. So what is important for us to remember in dark romanticism is that nature plays a very important role. Of course, in America, America is still a wilderness to a certain extent, better than, of course, what it was. But then again, at the same point of time, there is a society that is coming up. There is a kind of religion which is still present, and there is a moment of retrospect. There is a moment of subjective introspection of where nature, society, and religion comes together to frame the American form of life. So I think these become the most thematic understandings of Hawthorne's novel. The next writer that we are going towards is Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, he's more of a poet and a short story writer. Of course, he's a literary critic as well. But what is important for us to remember is that Edgar Allan Poe is also a person who is following the same dark romantic tradition. He is following, let's say, writings where he's trying to explore human mind, its intricacies, its fear, its anxiety, the same thing. All of them are completely supernatural, even detective to a certain extent. So these are important for us to remember. There is an element of science fiction. I don't think science fiction is that developed in Poe's short stories, but you find that there is an element of looking towards, let's say, empiricism, of seeing what kind of experiments make better a human life. But then his response is not scientific at all. His response is through the exploration of the supernatural. That is important for us to remember. So if you get a question which talks about supernaturalism and mysticism in a certain way, the darker emotions. For a novelist, the obvious choice would be Hawthorne. For a short story or a poet, short story writer or a poet, you might look into the option of Edgar Allan Poe. That becomes very important for us to remember, right? As I mentioned in the third point, he lets go of all points that lends fiction with a sense of reality. The idea of reality is very perturbed. There is a supernatural quality in his writings, and let us also understand this, that when a writer is writing in a supernatural strain of thought, he's not only looking at, let's say, a fairy tale or a dark fairy tale as such. He's also alluding to society. Every cultural production has an allusion to the societal condition. So when he's talking about, let's say, fear of there is a particular story called Ligia. So he's talking about identity, mistaken identities of incest, and those kind of social, let's say, purity. Those kind of fear is present in his writing. It is not only for those individual characters. It is also for America as a society. There is this idea of blind faith. There is this idea of fear, which is still, trumping over the idea of scientific, let's say, temperament. So that is very well being captured by Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, the other reason might be, of course, a writer might actually explore a particular genre more than anything else. But for him, we can remember that there is a societal function which is associated with his supernatural delineation as well. He chooses very unique subjects. His style is new because it has a dreamlike quality. If you read through his short stories, you will find it has a supernatural element, a dreamlike quality, confusion, mystery, all of that is present. Psychological exploration, as I said, that becomes the most important point in Edgar Allan Poe's writings. He talks about American subjectivity. America as a society was also looking into its own emotions. I mean, when we talk about, let's say, incest, a societal, let's say, a phenomenon like incest, in a particular established conservative order, that is looked down upon, that is punishable, right? But incest happens in society. The same thing happened in America as well. So how do we respond to that kind of emotions? What if we, people find that out? What if we are, let's say, expatriated, we are banished? So those kind of emotions are there present in Edgar Allan Poe's writings as well. The idea of murder, I mean, if you read through his writings, you will find that this idea of assassinating a person, this idea of identity being misplaced, detective, who is the murderer, who is not the murderer, all these play a very important role in his writings, because probably this idea of who America is, or what is America as a society, what is the dominant, let's say, milieu of the culture in American society, that was still under investigation. He was trying to find how crimes happen in American society, what humans feel in a society which is seeing a slightly, modernist scientific touch, but is also rooted deeply in superstition. So that becomes very important for us to remember. Some short stories that we can remember is the colloquy of Monos and Yuna. Repucin, his daughter, a very, very famous short story. This is a very, very famous short story, in fact. It talks about nature, it talks about poison, it talks about fear, again, anxiety and fear. Dr. Heidegger's experiment, it is completely, it talks about science, but it goes much beyond that. It talks about how humans are never, they can never understand what science really means. It looks at science also as a function of human creation. Ethan Brand, there is a particular character called Ethan Brand who is actually having certain experiences in a new town, and he's looking at the possibilities of getting lost and being found. So this idea of being lost and found, of creation and losing one's identity, that plays along again. Again, D.H. Lawrence, all of us know, I mean, people who have gone through British literature, he has commented on Pope that Poe's fiction is the separation of the body from the spirit, and that such a separation would be necessary if a real rebirth were to occur in America. So this idea of rebirth, of, as I talked about, incest, this idea of what America is, what is the pure dimension of America, that is always under investigation in Poe's understanding. D.H. Lawrence probably picks on that. And Poe's famous essays, he's also a critic, as I mentioned. The philosophy of composition, the rationale of verse, the poetic principle. He goes on talking, he defends poetry, and he says that a poem is essentially different from prose because it has a more subtle function of creation through, let's say, an allegorical enterprise. Probably a prose can be more direct, and hence it might be a little insipid, a little banal. But poetry has this idea of imagination that helps you to strike towards reality. So you take the, let's say, a more elevated route. You talk about imagination, you take it slow, but poetry directs you towards against social realities. That is something which is present in all these essays by Edgar Allan Poe. He also, Edgar Allan Poe, as such, he recognized Hawthorne's genius and he considered Dickens as an important influencer for him. I'm just mapping these out because these might be an MCQ questions. You never know. So yeah, um, I'm going to the next slide. Henry James, in fact, Henry James again is an American writer who we will discuss. Henry James considered Pope's criticism as most elaborate and exquisite specimen of provincialism ever prepared for edification of men. So he is elaborate, he is exquisite, and there is an idea of provincialism. I mean, provincialism means a familiar feeling, a commonality. When you read his poems or his short stories, you won't feel alienated because there are different modes of representing the supernatural. For him, his supernatural is rooted in familiarity. It's not very abstract. Then we have his detective stories, which are called tales of ratiocination. This is a very important point. I have seen MCQ questions coming in the late examination as well. Tales of ratiocination, these are detective tales where reason is given an upper hand. These are tales which are not very supernatural. They're detective. They talk about how, let's say they're of the Sherlock Holmes model. They talk about how you find clues and get to your conclusion. So there is a short story called The Gold Bug. There is The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter. That is a very interesting tale if you go through The Purloined Letter. It talks about how a letter, becomes the fulcrum of solving a detective case. It's just a letter. So that becomes very important. And Legia. Legia has a supernatural element. It talks about murder. It talks about mystical identity as well. But again, it is again seen from a detective point of view. So that probably can be added under the section of Tales of Ratiocination. Otherwise, the fall of the House of Usher, that is completely supernatural. I think many of you are acquainted with this particular short story. It talks about identity, it talks about incest, it talks about purity. All of that is very important. The assignation, Berenice, Morella. All Berenice and Morella, of course, are they are driven by very specific characters, but they also talk about let's say the kind of adventurism or romantic temperament that is built around a familiar situation for a woman in American society. Of course, it is not very topical, but it has an element of supernatural and an element of self-exploration that goes back to the condition of women in society. So, feminist reading of Berenice and Morella is possible. Salient features of dark or Gothic environment. I'll talk about the Gothic style. Yeah, as I talked about style and less into reality, there is a supernatural element, as I am repeatedly saying. And but again, we have to remember that supernatural is not something completely detached. There is an element of reality which can be read through the supernaturalism. You never know. A writer might just use it also as a cover to kind of escape censorship. So you never know what was Edgar Allan Poe's actual thrill in writing supernatural elements, tales. Right. Going to the next slide, we come across Herman Melville, again a very, very important writer. He's also a political commentator, a left-wing intellectual. He has this famous tales called the Piazza Tales. This is important for you again, MCQ. And there are, I think, three tales which are very important from that particular collection. One is Bottleby, one is Perito Sereno, another one is Incentator. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that both for Bottleby and Perito Sereno, we do not find, I mean, with Herman Melville, let me just say at the very outset, we don't find a supernatural tradition anymore. With Herman Melville, we are actually nearing a more direct social critical dimension, a more direct criticism of society. We are going into that age. We can see that it is again in the mid 19th century, but we have a sense of critical, let's say, engagement with society in a more direct manner in Herman Melville. Bartleby and Benito Sereno, they talk about the slave problem. Both of them have slave elements, and both of them also have elements in this idea of who is, let's say, a criminal. The idea of who does society look as a criminal. That is very well, I think, present in both Bartleby and Benito Sereno. It talks about slave revolt. It talks about how a person is deemed as a criminal when he has nothing to say in his own defense. So these critical themes become important right now in American literature. There is also the Incentives. It's not a very important critical writing, but it does have a very, very specific stylistic feature. It has echoes of the Fairy Queen of Spenser. I mean, there are 10 shorter parts of the Incantators, and we find that all of them begin with certain lines of the Fairy Queen. So that might be an MCQ question that Fairy Queen is being referred to in Continent. Uh, Billy Budd, that is also a very important, a novel. I think it is a novella by Herman Melville, and we find in Billy Budd as well this idea of who is the other figure, who is a slave, who is the master, who is let's say someone who is who is a person of color in American society. All these are being considered through certain these kind of novels. Moby Dick, that is a very very famous novel. Novel, I'm sure you people have heard about it. 1851. It talks about human exploration in the sea, a tale of revenge, a tale of death, a tale of confronting nature. I mean, of course, we have a sea whale, a sperm of a sea whale. I mean, being the center of the entire thing. I mean, the entire narrative. But we find that human actually tackling nature. This becomes a very important trope in American literature throughout. Human, I mean, as I talked about the northwestern frontier and the idea of expansion, the same thing is playing out in Moby Dick as well. Here in sea, how are you conquering nature? So the American dream is not only to establish society, but also to control nature. Someone might just see, the glimmers of capitalism and colonizing drive, neo-colonizing drive, let's say, that being the streaks of that being shown in the American view right now. So Moby Dick is a very, very important novel for that matter. Confidence Man, it talks about several characters. Again, it is more important for its style than its content. It kind of mimics the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So that might be again another important question for your MCQ. Um, Another thing which is important for us to remember that Melville was a direct victim of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. His eldest son, he died in 1867, right after the war, because he was injured and never quite recovered from the trauma. So that might be a question for your MCQ. He also writes an epic known as A Poem and Pilgrimage in the Holy Land, going back to again the idea of the Garden of Eden, of America being a paradisical society, all of that. One essay that concerns the idea of gender is The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tortures of Maid. Again, this is for your MCQ. Um, uh, uh, he actually portrays women in a form where women probably have the potential in them to resist patriarchal domination. I mean, that is the main theme of that particular essay. He talks about how females in their own silences can also use tropes of fighting against patriarchy. So that might be an essay that you might remember for your. I'm sorry. Yeah, that might be an essay very important for your MCQ. Yeah. Again, Melville was actually not discussed much for a certain period of time. He was revived by a scholar named Carl van Hetchem in his treatise called The Double Dealer. It's kind of an essay, an article where he talks about Melville, and that is when Melville comes back to the American scholarly attention. So that again might be an important name for your MCQ. His biography has been written by Louis Mumford. His poetry, Battle Pieces, not very significant, but had been lauded by R.P. Warren and Lawrence Will. R.P. Warren, those of us know New Criticism. He has been a person who actually looked more into form of a particular poem than its content. New Criticism is all about that. So R.P. Warren actually lauded his form. The way he writes poems. And Lawrence Buell has an eco-critical point of view. He also talks about eco-criticism. So we find in Moby Dick, in Bottleby, the idea of ship, the idea of sea, the idea of nature that is present. So probably that becomes an important point in his poems as well. I mean, I haven't read it personally, so I can't comment on it much. But Battle Pieces is the most significant poetry collection that he has ever written. But though it's not very significant in the entire American poetic overview. Right. Next, we go to Walt Whitman. Many of us know about Walt Whitman already. He is a part of the transcendentalist movement. Also, he talks about realism because he talks about the America of the present day. He doesn't look into supernaturalism. He doesn't take the route of euphemism. He talks about how America has a more critical function to play. He talks about the American dream, and probably a little exaggeration, a little more hyperbole tendency can be found in that. He has been called not a soft but kind of a conservative nationalist in a way because he is the poet of America, as many people have referred him to. So the poet of America is Walt Whitman. We can remember that for the MCQ again. He talks about the American dream, but that American dream is not very inclusive. In his American dream, he talks about America as the superior leader of the entire world, the torchbearer of civilization, and the rest of the world following it. So, the hyper nationalist trait can be found in Walt Whitman. There is an element of sensuality because if you read, there are poems by him called something referring to the electric guitar and stuff. You will find a lot of sensuality and corporal allusions being made. So these are tropes that is important for Walt Whitman. He has a sensual flavor. Of course, his most famous collection of poem, and that is a huge a poetic enterprise. It's called Leaves of Grass. Yeah, so I was talking about that electric guitar reference. That was a poem called "Icing the Body Electric." So there is this idea of the body, being charged to work and to kind of imbibe all kinds of American sensualities. The dream, the anger, the rush, the adrenaline, all of that has been portrayed over there. And Leaves of Grass again becomes the most important poetic collection that he has ever written, 1855. Right. Next, we go on to Emily Dickinson. Yeah, she actually has a much more subjective way to look at life. As I said, every every kind of literature begins with an objective point of view. It slowly passes it down into subjective ethos. Now we have Emily Dickinson, a poetic Emily Dickinson, who is throughout subjective. I mean, the way she depicts poetry, it's not the very corny confessional type. It has, in its form, it has an element of objectivity, but more or less, her emotions are purely subjective. She was highly influenced by George Eliot. That might be important. Of course, the Victorian era was running in Britain at that point of time. A net question, probably, I mean, an MCQ question, probably. Her collected volumes, the poems of Emily Dickinson, comes out in 3 volumes. Has been edited by Richard P. Sewell. I mean, an MCQ question again. Ted Hughes, of course, you know that Ted Hughes I mean, he also commented on Emily Dickinson quite a few times. In fact, the most pertinent comment that he made was that the conflicts in Emily Dickinson is something that uh, is my presentation visible? I'm just asking one. Is it visible? Hello.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you.
The presentation is visible, but you are not audible sometimes.
Okay. Just let me know when I'm not audible. Maybe there's a problem with the microphone. Hello.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So I'll continue with that. So her collected volume is called The Poems of Emily Dickinson. It comes out in 3 volumes. It has been edited by Richard B. Sewell. Uh, Ted Hughes actually compared the conflicts in her own poem to that of America. Because if you read Emily Dickinson's biography, I have read a bit of it. You will know that Emily Dickinson was a poet who was, of course, who had a very a kind of life which was very isolated in a way. But this is not true that she never wanted to go out in the world. She probably wanted to go out in the world, but she had her moments of, let's say, self-evaluation, moments of anxiety, which always played a very conflicting nature in her own, let's say, writings. So she wanted to go out in the world, but she was always obsessed with the idea of self-exploration. So this idea of what a society means to an American and what an individual personal life means to an American, personal thoughts, personal ambitions, personal way of life versus social way of life. That becomes a very important theme in Emily Dickinson, and Ted Hughes comments on that, compares her to the macrocosmic America. For those of us who have read Emily Dickinson, you will know that she goes on talking about death and eternity. These are very important tropes in her poems. So any American, like, poem which talks about a lot on death and eternity, you might see Emily Dickinson as an option probably. But there are certain poems which also talks about scientific explorations. There is a poem on telescope. There is a poem on compass. So she actually also writes a little on nature and science, but mostly her writings are typically on the idea of life, on death, and has a very poignant flavor. If you go through her poems, it has very strong star cadences. So that might be a segregating factor that you might look into when you face questions on Emily Dickinson. Um, Pre 1861, you see that she was writing a slightly more sentimental poems. Post 1861, her poems become a little more celebratory. Celebratory, not in the sense that she talks about partying and all, not in that way, but it is celebrating life, looking at death and eternity from a more optimist point of view, a more positive point of view. So that is important for us to remember. unusual ellipses. Her idiom is a little, as I said, there's a very poignant flavor. When you read through her poetry, you will understand that. She does a lot of metrical experimentation. There is free verse, there is blank verse. All of that is present in her writings. She writes in dimeter, trimeter, and tetrameter more than pentameter. Pentameter, of course, in English poetry is a standard, prosody, the measure of prosody. But we find that she is writing in dimeter, trimeter, and tetrameter, often in free verse and blank verse as well. So blank verse, it doesn't follow meters. Sorry, yeah. I mean, free verse doesn't follow meters. Right. So she makes use of both blank verse and free verse. That is also something that we can keep in mind. She uses slant rhyme, which I mean, slant rhyme is, of course, it doesn't really have a proper recurring rhyming pattern, but you see that there are certain lines, ending of certain lines, which kind of complement certain other lines much later. They're not, in a very cohesive structure. So there is this element of slant rhyme. Certain rhymes are almost kind of, they kind of complement each other in the middle of a verse. So these kind of things are present. Of course, she has a set of poems which has been called the master poems, which talks about death and eternity as a master figure. There is one famous poem, I think many of you know it, because I could not stop for death. Poems like that. She also writes a lot of gospel poems. One thing that is fundamental about Emily Dickinson is that though her poetic, zeal does not reveal a lot of religious fanaticism. I mean, in the sense that religious conservatism, but you find that there have been poems which talk about biblical myths. I mean myths in the sense biblical history. So that becomes important. Not that she was very conservative by nature, but she was an ardent believer in God. So that is one thing that we can remember. And there are many poems. When I talked about, there are certain poems that talk about compass, that talks about microscope, it talks about discovering various scientific discoveries. In certain poems, running parallel to this particular theme, America is also seen as a continent which is yet to be explored, not only in objective geographical terms but also through subjective measures. So that becomes important. Probably we can look at Poem Hunter or sites like that, Poetry Foundation. Just read through a couple of her poems. You will understand what kind of poignance I'm talking about. Right. The next writer that we go right now towards is Mark Twain. I think most of us are familiar with Mark Twain, Samuel Longhorn Clemens. Deals American society, of course, slavery, race, addiction, social hypocrisy. We come towards full-blown criticism of American society by now. Mark Twain has been extremely brave in the kind of writings he has done. And by the way, Mark Twain's writing, you have gone through Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, and you will not find any of these fictional writings polemical. They're not polemical that to that extent. They are in a very humorous mode, sometimes in a humorous mode, but there are certain grave instances which echo throughout the book, especially slavery. That there is a particular term, the idea of nigger, that we say, that was used by Mark Twain both in Tom Sawyer and especially in Huckleberry Finn. And I think Huckleberry Finn was banned as well because of this reason. It was censored because nigger was brought into the mainstream language. So he experiments with language. He talks about that, and he also goes to the dialect of the in African Americans, the slaves as such. He also talks about he actually gives that kind of dialect to his characters. So that becomes a very important point for us to remember. The Innocents Abroad, it talks about European and American dream simultaneously. The urge to go back to America, the urge to stay in, they go back to Europe, the urge to stay in America, all that plays together. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Most of us know the story of Tom Sawyer, and of course, it looks very kiddish in a way, but it has very grave social dimensions to be explored. One of them is definitely the character of Huckleberry Finn, the character of a vagrant figure. Of course, we have references to the slave culture, if you remember. Also, of course, Huckleberry Finn himself, his novel is much more prolific, the one on Huckleberry Finn, and that was censored as such. It has, I think, I forgot the name of the character, but there is one particular character, very main character, who was portrayed as a slave, and slave trade was also kind of discussed in detail, of course, in a fictional way. The other novels which are important is Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Again, there is the idea of Yankee, the American, the cowboy figure and those kind of figures. You will find those kind of tropes being utilized in Mark Twain. King Arthur's Court, by the way, is, I mean, it definitely has a mythical dimension. It goes back to the history of Britain and the continent also. So in that way, he's also looking at the mythical understanding of a found, let's say a society or a nation, and kind of communicating it with, let's say, today's, I mean, that time's America. So there is an idea of time lapse, an idea of time travel. Life on the Mississippi, very important again. Mississippi, of course, that Mark Twain himself he writes mostly on the southern part of America, which was always, which propagated slave trade much more than the northern part. I think most of us know that. So those dark details also come out, and of course, Southern America is more driven by forest and native tribes. So that is also important. And of course, Tom Sawyer Detective, that also becomes important for us to remember. That is another novel, in fact. A double barrel detective story. It talks about, it has, it initially had a collection of stories, but double barrel detective stories also kind of found in one piece. There are shorter stories which are of importance. The facts concerning the carnival of crime in Connecticut, the man that corrupted Hadleyburg. What is a man? A very, very important short story as such. It talks about kind of the twinning impulses in man to love himself and also to live a life of luxury and debauchement. That is important. How to be an honest congressman through a Christian, though a Christian. This is important because he actually makes it very satirical in a way. He says that being a Christian, you cannot be an honest congressman. He of course talks about slave trade and corruption in America at that point of time. The other short story which is also very important is Letter from the Earth. I think the theme is that there is a devil, I mean Satan himself, is writing letters to God and saying that I don't really need to do a lot of things. Your humans in your promised land have already indulged in corruption, so they are mine to take. Something like that. I mean, that is a brief, I mean, summary of that particular thematic summary of that particular short story. So Mark Twain is very interesting in American literacy, right? Now, these are minor figures that we might remember. Crane, Norris, and London. Stephen Crane, he writes a novel called George's Mother. This is just for your MCQ. I mean, they are not very important figures as such. But then, nevertheless, he talks about the American dream. He talks about a mother's ambition for her son, but also the problems in giving up vanity. I mean, of course, all of us know that ambition comes with a share of vanity itself. And here, the balancing of, let's say, ambition and vanity that comes along, where does honesty go in between? Those kind of questions are kind of introspected and explored in this particular novel. Maggie and the Red Badge of Courage. Red Badge of Courage also talks about the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, of course, the kind of war that liberated America from slavery. So that also becomes an important point for Stephen Crane to take up. Frank Norris, he writes a novel called Vandover and the Brute, A Man's Woman, Mourn of the Lady. He deals with immigration crisis, the idea of coexistence and gender roles. I mean, if you see A Man's Woman, you will see that he actually criticizes patriarchy quite starkingly. I mean, the idea is that there is a woman, there's a homemaker who is kind of living with a man, and she's been subjected to all kinds of tortures, but at the end, she actually kind of rebels. She rebels, goes out of the home, almost like a doll's house, Ibsen's doll's house, something like that. Yeah. Um, so the immigration crisis, coexistence, these become very important themes in Frank Norris's literary imagination and his let's say artistic output. And Jack London, of course, his writing is more autobiographical. Martin Eden, very, very autobiographical. Even what is important for Jack London is that his autobiography is not very subjective. He talks more about other people than himself. He has an objective balance with his subjective impulses. But what he is kind of famous for, is this trilogy of of a story, stories consisting, talking about wolves as central characters. The Call of the Wild, The Sea Wolf, White Fang. All these three stories deal with wolves actually encounter with his own group, with encounter with wild dogs, encounter with forest. All of these are very important. Why? Because he's not only actually talking about a wolf or an animal from that sense of term. He's more like Ted Hughes. I mean, Ted Hughes talks about birds, if you remember. For him, an American, facing Europeans or the immigration crisis or fellow Americans, and how he reacts to wilderness, to nature in America, to scientific progress. All of that has been allegorized through the themes of of the wolf and the wild. So that will be important for us to remember. So when we read these novels, it is not only about the animals, but it is also about American society, Americans trying to look for progress, and also to kind of trying to control nature and science both. So these are important. I said metaphorical and allegorical for Americans, right? We're moving to the next slide. Kate Chopin's, of course, she is a very, very prominent female writer that we can remember. There is a story called At Fault, and it actually talks about how a widow, she kind of takes on a business that is left to her by her husband, and how she actually goes on an enterprising business, faces obstacles, but nevertheless goes on to succeed. This is important. This is not only proto-feminist. I think it's more than proto-feminist. It's radical in a way because it talks about a woman going out in the man's world and taking up business. And business is, of course, it's very business is. I mean, at that time, it was not imagined to be a woman's, let's say, deal. So at that time, writing a women's emotions, sexual emotions, and adultery. That is again, that is a mark of the kind of progress that is being noted in the writings of that age. The Awakening is a very, very famous novel by Kate Chopins. It is a story of a woman who is stunned to realize her happiness on her husband's death in an accident. So the story is that her husband actually goes to a railway station and he tries to cross the railway tracks and he is killed in an accident. Before this thing happens, there is a moment of retrospect where the woman thinks that everything is fine in her life and she's very happy, though she lacks space, she lacks freedom. But once her husband dies, she's supposed to cry and mourn, but she doesn't cry. She, in fact, she feels no relief. She feels that she has been released from some kind of prison. So again, the intimate relationship of a woman with her own, that has been very well portrayed in this particular novel. It's a part of that, if you know this particular term, it's called écriture feminine. It's a part of that stream of writings. It's writing about the body and the mind. It's almost crying through the body. It's that kind of writing. If you read this particular novel, you will understand. It's quite poignant in a way. Yeah. The other female writer who is also very important at this age is Sarah Orne-Jewett. She talks about American society, American Civil War, more objective, doesn't really go into very, very detailed intricacies of human life. The novel is called The Country of Pointed First. It's almost an epical novel. It goes on and on. There is a story of Almira Todd, of dynasty and business. Again, a woman dealing with business, looking at dynasty from her own perspective, radical to a point, of gardening, herb gathering, which are womanly qualities, but also looking about on business. So you see, a woman is being given functions of not only kind of doing jobs that suit a woman, but is also going beyond that to the man's world of business. Talks about man and nature. I said American Dream also talks about the wild nature that Americans have to overcome. So man and nature becomes perpetual themes again. She discusses about her characters in her village. She becomes a silent witness of change, cuts across generations. There is a lodger. I mean, there is someone, a guest who actually comes and sits to talk with her. He becomes a listener. But at the same point, we find that she talks about what goes on in the entire society. She talks about business, about her own hobby of gardening, of dynasties coming and going, of generations coming across. She's almost a silent witness of the entire American society. So that from that perspective, this novel might be a little important. Yeah, Henry James. I think many of us have already we are acquainted with his name. Henry James, of course, he explored both British and American connections. He, in fact, did not like America that much. He felt the continent, not only Britain, but the continent, especially Italy. I mean, he had a knack towards Italy. He found those countries much more interesting, and he found that Italy and the continents, Germany, they have much more culture in them than America. Probably one of the reasons is that America was still a conflicted society. And democracy comes with its own conflict. So yeah, so from that way, right. Uh, he wrote shorter stories and novels which were located in Paris and England. The plots were located in Paris and England. He claimed to be inspired by Emerson, though I don't think in his writing you would really find qualities of Emerson, but he was a romantic too, to a certain extent. Psychological explorations and its associations with social reality. There are novels, these are quite famous novels. Roderick Hudson, A Portrait of a Lady, The Princess, The Golden Bowl, A Passionate Pilgrim, Daisy Miller. I think many of us have heard it's a novella. In the Cage. All of these more or less deal with Americans who are going to the continent, settling there or having a sojourn, and then being called back. They are being influenced by the continental culture, and they're not being able to kind of adapt to the American dream. So to Henry James, American dream was not a very positive understanding. To him, continent had more of culture, to a cultural promise that America could ever have. So this is something which we can remember while attempting questions on Henry James. His shorter stories, A Tragedy of Error, The Story of a Year, The Figure in the Carpet. Again, all of them more or less deal with your how the continent influences American people, because there are people who are actually going to the continent and coming back in his stories. So this is becoming important. The Story of a Year also concerns the American dream and how futile it is. He actually talks about the element of competition in American dreams and thinks that America is becoming less human in many ways. So that becomes important. His non-fiction is, it's called The Art of Fiction. He talks about how fiction should be written, and Henry James had a knack towards stream of consciousness. I think many of us know what stream of consciousness is. They have studied in our UG, so that becomes important. He actually prescribes kind of stream of consciousness as a very effective tool of literature. His travelogues include Italian Hours, The American Scene. For your questions on your MCQ, so that might be important. The next writer of prominence would be Theodore Dreiser. He has he actually gives into subjective emotions. He has been very well influenced by Freud. Freud, the id, ego, superego, those kind of theories. And towards the later part of his writings, he was also a witness to the collapse of American economy. If you go back to the American history, you will see that there is something called the Roaring Twenties. 1920s initially was a period of extreme economic growth, but a boom and stuff. Suddenly, 1929, we find there is a Great Depression that sets in, which kind of destabilizes American dream. He was writing in those periods, and in his writings, you will find both subjective notions of what Americans are or what they're trying to find in the American dream, also with the economy, running parallel with the economy, how economy engenders human dreams. Finance and emotions, they don't really go hand in hand, but that is what he's exploring in most of these novels. Sister Katie, a very famous novel, the same thing happens over here. She actually becomes a person who goes on thinking about her own dreams, meeting new people, and what constitutes the American dream for a woman. That becomes very important in Sister Carey's plot. An American Tragedy, it talks about extreme human competition and how disillusionment comes along in a capitalist society. So that has been very well portrayed. Gallery of Women, Jenny Graham, more or less all of these deal with how economy was burgeoning and how human dreams were actually becoming more and more futile. The idea of competition. Financial probably deals with it in a more direct way. He also believed that Americans, they lack sensitiveness and sentimentality. As I talked about the futility of American dream, he said that there is no specific essence in American individuals. He preferred England over USA. So there is this entire generation called the lost generation. If you have heard this term, these are people who have been ravaged by the First World War, and then the competition of American market, and then the Great Depression, and they found America devoid of a proper, solid cultural experience. To them, Britain or the continent had much more capital. I mean, sorry, cultural promise than America could have. So he also falls in the line of Henry James to a certain extent. Um, the next slide brings us to Edith Wharton, again a female writer. Henry James called her the great and glorious pendulum. Very important for your MCQ. Um, she writes a novel called A Backward Glance, where she gives a moving account of American life, from religion to secular elevation of life. So again, she has that chronicling tendency. This is important, you see, even in the novel called The Point at First. Okay, the same thing happens over there as well. The lady is almost a chronicler. So this revisiting history, going back to what we are or what we have been, the exploration of identity through past and present, and the dream of the future, that runs very parallelly in American literary scene, even in the 20th century. So you see how remarkable this particular theme is, right from the 17th century to the 20th century. It runs along. He collaborated with Ogden Codman on an. I think this was a novel. It was kind of a non-fiction, but it had fictional elements as well, and it deals with gardening and architecture, stuff like that. Mainly architecture, and it is called The Decoration of Houses. Other novels which would be important is The Greater Inclination, The Valley of Decision, Italian Villas. Again, it deals with architecture. The House of Mirth, quite important as a novel. The Reef, The Age of Innocence. More or less, the last three novels, The House of Mirth, The Reef, The Age of Innocence, they deal with complex human relationships, the relationships between a man and a woman, between society and an individual. The same exploration is done, but the complexity is remarkable from a female perspective. It's quite remarkable that way. So these novels might be important for you to look up for your, examination. Next, we come to Robert Frost. Most of us are acquainted with his name. He's called the poet of sense and sound. Frost himself remarked that to him, sound matters more in a verse than anything else. He called the sound of sense a living part of a poem. I've quoted it. Of course, he has won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. In poetry 4 times. So that is quite remarkable. His collection of poems read "A Boy's Will," "North of Boston." In a Boy's Will, you will find these famous poems, which again have to be looked up. The Tuft of Flowers, Moving October. I think you might know one or two over here. North of Boston, a very, very famous poetic collection. Mending Wall, which is a very, very important poem. It talks about how neighbors interact in human lives. The wall that segregates human experience, but also how to kind of mend the wall in a way where experiences can be conjoined as well. So Mending Wall. After Apple Picking, a very famous poem again. The Wood Pile, Home Burial, The Death of the Hired Man, The Black Cottage. Black Cottage is romantic. Of course, Frost was romantic in many ways. A Servant to Servants, he was praised by Edward Thomas and Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, of course, he will also come into the picture, but Ezra Pound praised him because of his sense and sound. Ezra Pound is not a poet who praises on the idea of content. He went through the form of every poem. I mean, even for his own scholarship. Other poetic collections which would be important is Steeple Bush. It's not that famous. A Witness Tree, somewhat kind of people have praised it to a certain extent. Mountain Interval is quite famous, comes out in 1916. New Hampshire is also kind of important. 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Mountain Interval, there are these poems which might be important for you. An Old Man's Winter Night, Moving, The Figure a Poem Makes, To Look at Two. Most of them actually talk about nature and how human beings interact with it. Moving is one glaring example. Even An Old Man's Winter Night talks about nature. Yeah. And there is this Witness Tree. You find poems, Spring Pools, Acquainted with the Night, the Onset, Nothing Gold Can Say. Not very famous poems, but nevertheless, if you might just look at them if you want to like read in detail. That is all about Robert Frost. Next, we go to Eliot. I think Eliot, of course, also has been studied in British literature. Again, he was American. He was an American who preferred London, so he follows Henry James and Theodore Dreiser and all of them. He was conscious of his relatively smaller literary career. Like Eliot himself remarked at a point of time that a poet of my stature should have written much more, voluminously. So that you might remember. Prufrock and his observations. I think most of us know the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's a very, very famous poem. It talks about human impotency, human meaninglessness, sense of identity, sense of a broken human life, all that modernity stands for. 1922, The Wasteland. I think most of us are acquainted with this poem. Wasteland is a phenomenal piece, of course, called "A Cobweb of Illusions" by a lot of poets. I mean, our critics, they said that Wasteland is a cobweb of illusions. So it actually talks about form and meaning in the sense that there is nothing much in life to discover. There is no congruency. So that might be important for us to notice. The Hollow Men, 1909 and 25. Again, Hollow Men deals with the importance of human life. Um, then you have 1910, The Hardware Advocate, Inventions of the March Hare. These poems are not very well known, but they're just for your information. Also, his important poems include, I was talking about poetic collections, The Hardware Advocate and Inventions of the March Hare. Those collections are not very important. But important poems also include Ash Wednesday. I think most of you have heard about it. Four quartets, for which he actually got the Nobel Prize. Four quartets has a very, very strong spiritual undertone. If you have gone through the poem, you will see that it talks about, again, the meaningless of human life, the idea of darkness. He plays with the idea of darkness and grayness. He says that unless and until the entire social milieu becomes dark, there will be no point of renunciation. He talks about how human lives can be let's say brought on tax by the notion of spirituality. So Eliot was spiritual to a great extent. Of course, people who have read Westland, you know how it concludes. So yeah, Journey of the Magi, a very very famous poem, a song for Simon and Imura. More or less, it deals with the importance of life and let's say the exploration of what human life might have meant. I mean, more or less, these are the thematic concerns. He followed Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatists, and of course, his plays include Murder in the Cathedral, which is very famous. The Cocktail Party again. I think Family Reunion as well. So these are the three plays which are more or less important. Also, I think he wrote a lot on Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatists. I don't remember the name of the treatises, but he was actually very, very inspired by Elizabethan dramatists. Of course, Sweeney Agnostis, that is a verse drama. There is a collection of, I mean, there are a collection of poems by the name of Sweeney poems, even for Eliot. His Sweeney Agnostis, probably he was looking towards Milton, by the way he has borrowed the name, but more or less, Sweeney Agnostis is also about human life and the sense of alienation, more or less. And that is probably why Eliot was actually moving to Britain. So one thing that we can see at this point is that many writers, right after the World War, are preferring the European continent over America. So the American, let's say, dream was being alienated to a certain extent in the writings of these kind of writers. So that we might notice. Next is Ezra Pound. Of course, he is very infamous for his support to the to Italy's Mussolini's that party, which is the of course the fascist party. But he was a prolific writer, and he was a very dear friend of T.S. Eliot. He was associated with the medium called Imagism. If you know, Imagism actually deals with this idea that poem should not reveal sentimentality. Poem should not be subjective. Poem should actually have an objective function. It should represent images which or where people can go and explore even deeper. So that is the idea that Ezra Pound talks about in Imagism. It's about images. It's not about subjective emotions. So you will find that on the net also if you read. Yeah, this movement is very significant in modernist theory. His obsession was with form. To him, content mattered less, but in the form, what is the form that is being written? Even you can actually you relate with the neoclassical tendencies, Dr. Johnson and all in the British period, right? So he was one of those writers who actually wanted to stress on form, on images, and not on sentiments. Even Eliot talks about that sentiments actually harm a poem. So the same thing. Uh, he loved Italian culture. He, in fact, followed Dante to a large extent. His important poems include Ripostes, Hugh Selwyn, Moberly, and the Cantos. The Cantos is almost an epical poem. It goes on, and there are, I think, 16 or 17 cantos. I don't remember the exact number, but because that Cantos is objective. It talks about a royal dynasty and the fall of it, all of that. Also, Ezra Pound, what might be important for your MCQ is that he helped James Joyce, publish the novel called The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So that might be important. He did collaborate with James Joyce as well. So that might be an important information. Next, we go to William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens. Both of them are modernist poets in the sense of the term, but both of them have extreme postmodernist tendencies. For us who know what modernism is, you will understand that modernism talks about a particular belief system. Even for Eliot, who was trying to look into human experience, there was a structure at looking at the fluidity of life. But there are poets who actually go on to the postmodern experience, which is almost presented in a way where no form or structure matters at all. It is a complete break with convention. That is postmodern thought for you. And both William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens actually are postmodern in certain ways. William Carlos Williams is, of course, much more postmodern. He associated himself with the movements modernism and imagism, but again, I said you might look up on his poems. He has a very strong postmodern touch. His poetic collections are called The Desert Music and Other Poems, Pictures from Bruegel and Other Poems. Of course, a very famous poem is the Red Wheelbarrow. Generally, people don't ask questions from other poems written by William Carlos Williams, but the Red Wheelbarrow is a very important poem. You might just look that up. That's a very short poem. You will understand what kind of postmodern elements are present. He was, by the way, very close to painting. Um, now Wallace Stevens, he wrote this poetic collection called The Man with the Blue Guitar, and his important poems include The Auroras of Autumn, Anecdote of the Jar, Disillusionment of 10 o'clock. That is a very famous poem, Disillusionment of 10 o'clock. There is this depiction of a man who was trying to get the last train back home. So that would the futility of life again being expressed, but not from a very modernist point of view. A little emotive, but also in a very fragmented way. When it comes to the form of the poem. The Emperor of Ice Cream, again a very famous poem. Sunday Morning, The Snowman, 13 Ways of Looking at the Blackbird, again a very famous poem. You must just look at these three poems for your understanding. Disillusionment of 10 o'clock, The Emperor of Ice Cream, and 13 Ways of Looking at the Blackbird. These three poems will make you understand what kind of poetry he was writing. So that might be important for you when you pick your answer in your MCQ. Next, we go to Bilya Kether. Of course, she is a novelist and she is a woman. Of course, she deals with ways of remembering her youth. So again, that moment of retrospect. What is very important is that this idea of chronicling, of going back, revisiting past, that is always present. And always, when we talk about going back to history, we are talking about going back to one's own identity. So that becomes a very important part in the entire canon of American literature, even in 1950s and 1960s America. So you might well understand. Um, yeah, her novels include "O Pioneers," "The Song of the Lark," "My Antonia," "One of Ours." Now, One of Ours actually gets the Pulitzer Prize. What is important is that in all the four novels that she writes, she deals completely with women's emotions alone. She's not really concerned with society or man as such. Her entire, let's say, her entire focus, the idea of focalization, that is completely on women. How women actually react to situations that govern both her homely life and her ambition. Like for example, the Song of the Lark. That is a story of a woman who actually goes after a singing career, and she goes to North America. I mean, of course, North America was the land of the dream. South America still, it was agrarian, it was backward to a certain extent, but North America was the hub of dreams, and there she was actually going to kind of pursue her musical career, the kind of companions that helped her through the kind of let's say betrayals she faced, all of that. It's kind of an entire journey of life. People say it is slightly autobiographical, but then that is debatable. All the four novels, more or less, even My Antonia to a certain extent, it talks about a woman's understanding of her own life when she goes out to the man's working space to work. The same thing, more or less, is portrayed in these four novels. So these are thematic things which might be important for you to reconsider your options when you are facing your MCQs. Next, we go on to F. Scott Fitzgerald. Very important. I think most of you have heard his name, The Great Gatsby. The film was also quite a success. Yeah. So he popularized the Jazz Age. Jazz Age really comes in the towards the end of the 1910s, I mean 1915, 1916 onwards, and goes on to the 1920s, the roaring 20s as such. He has written four remarkable novels, four short story collections, and 164 short stories. That information I could collect. But yeah, his famous novels are This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and the Damned, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night. Of course, most of us know what Great Gatsby is about. It's about an American dream. It's about romance. It's about all that luxury, the sense of non-fulfillment of emotions. but having very strong material ambitions. All of that is present in The Great Gatsby. This Side of Paradise and Beautiful and the Damned both have overtly tones of the First World War. This side of Paradise, in fact, deals with the World War. The story is located about the World War, and Beautiful and the Damned, there is a romantic, of course, plot. But you see that one of the main characters, one of the main male characters, he has been rendered impotent after he had joined the First World War. So, from that perspective, you see the First World War actually kind of becomes a very important point, or a theme for Fitzgerald. His unfinished novel, this actually came in the net examination, I think, twice or thrice. Unfinished novel is called The Last Tycoon, published by Edmund Wilson. That might be very important for your MCQ. Of course, he belonged to the lost generation, coined by the term lost generation was coined by Gertrude Stein, expatriate American writers who were actually going to continent. I mean, I was already talking about Henry James and Eliot and Pound and all of them. So the same thing. He also belonged to that generation, though I don't think Fitzgerald actually was very disillusioned with American life, where he had to relocate. That did not happen, but nevertheless, he was disillusioned. There is this idea of industrial revolution in US, which was not very received positively by Fitzgerald. The idea of mechanical world and life. Of course, World War One, I had mentioned it, the Roaring Twenties, and again economic depression, how American ambitions were being punctured by the economic crisis. That becomes important. Next is Ernest Hemingway. Yeah, Ernest Hemingway is the one who actually popularized Gertrude Stein's term "lost generation." It was coined by Gertrude Stein. Again, a net question. I mean, an MCQ question, but it was popularized by Ernest Hemingway. He coined the iceberg theory, which might be important because I've seen this question come quite a few times. Iceberg theory is a theory which talks about minimalist representation in literature. It says that you don't need to write literature in a very voluminous, rigorous way. You might just mention the main components of a write up, and it is the reader's duty to explore more into it. I mean, more emotions into it. So that way, the iceberg theory is important. This was published. I mean, the iceberg theory was mentioned in this, uh, you know. In this particular non-fiction fragment called "Death in the Afternoon," 1932. Also, the iceberg theory has mentions in "A Movable Feast," which is a memoir, kind of autobiographical. It talks about his own journey as a writer. So that might also be important for your MCQ. His biographer is Carlos Baker. He gets the Nobel Prize in 1954, and of course, his famous novels are Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea. Of course, the most common or the most popular is The Old Man and the Sea. It shows a man's resistance against nature, also his defeat in nature, but again, his determination stands strong, something like that. The American prototypical theme of battling nature, conquering it, that is recounted. For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Sun Also Rises, and Farewell to Arms, all the three have explicit mentions to the First World War. Again, the idea of importance of a man who has gone to a war, a failed romance, the kind of Spanish, I think, for whom the Bell Tolls talks about the Spanish Civil War. All of that, I mean, the war as a very important theme recurs on and on in these writers of the lost generation, both Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. The next writers that are important, they are not very important, but they are kind of significant probably in certain ways. John Dos Passos, he is a novelist and he writes the USA trilogy, the 42nd Parallel, the 1919, and the Big Money. All of these deal with historical situations. It talks about the rise of America, the rise of colonial power, and of course the First World War. First World War has also been a very important theme in the 1919, even the Big Money for that matter. So what is important is that John Dos Passos has a different way to write his novels. His novels are more journalistic. He writes almost as a journalist. So that would be important for us to consider. Journalistic prose goes to John Dos. It has been a very important formal, let's say, artistic trait of John Dos Passos. For Nathaniel West, you find there are two very dark novels, Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust, which talks about First World War, but it primarily talks about romance and heartbreaks. Not very important, but you might just remember if you want to keep it in your mind for your detail. Yeah. Next is Eugene O'Neill, a dramatist, of course, a reputed dramatist, and He is the torchbearer of American realism. He followed the tradition of Anton Chekhov, Russian, of course, Ibsen, Norwegian, and Strindberg, who was Austrian. So, Eugene O'Neill's famous plays are Beyond the Horizon, Anna Christie, Desire Under the Elms, Strange Interlude, Morning Becomes Electra. Eugene O'Neill's realism is very, very stark. I mean, his realism is not, the kind of simple realism that you get. If you look at Morning Becomes Electra, there is this idea of a family where, incest is taking a very center stage in the play. Of course, the Electra complex, you see, that has already been mentioned in the title itself. So these are very important themes for him. So his realism is not only, let's say, tangible realism; it is psychological realism as well. That we have to keep in mind. Anna Christie, of course, is a very famous play for that matter as well. Beyond the Horizon, Desire Under the Elms. It talks about a family which actually kind of is actually struggling to meet its own American dreams. Again, that becomes important. But mostly, I think all the plays more or less deal with psychological explorations more than economic reality. So that will be important for us to remember. Of course, other important plays include The Iceman Cometh. It's a very dark play, by the way. If you read through it, the ending is quite dark. The protagonist commits suicide and loses his mind, gives into insanity. So that kind of stark realism is portrayed in The Iceman Cometh. A Moon for the Misgotten. Emperor Jones. It has anti-colonial tones. It talks about an African American who becomes an emperor in a foreign land, tries to escape, but then he is unable to. So that becomes a very important play again. Long Day's Journey into Night. This again deals with American dream and how American dreams kind of, the main conflict is about whether you can acquire more and more riches, and whether you can also kind of keep along your family values and that kind of intimacy, private intimacy among family members. The same thing is there in Long Day's Journey into Night. It's quite pathetic in a way. So these are important plays that you might look into. Of course, he was very close to the communist leader. I mean, he was the pioneer of the Communist Party, John Reed. And there is a film I think which has been made on John Reed called The Reds or something, and he plays a very important figure. Speculation says that Eugene O'Neill had an affair with John Reed's wife, so he becomes a very, very important figure not only in the political landscape of communism in America, but also to in the let's say in the in the personal literary influence of the communist doctrine in his writings. Of course, he's not polemical, but he has a communist bent of mind when he's talking about family culture and criticizing capitalist notions of life. Next, we come to William Faulkner. Very, very important for your examination or for your whatever, I mean, NET examination as well, for that matter. He is, of course, a very, very prominent writer of the South. Probably the most important writer of the South that America has ever generated. He gets his Nobel Prize in 1949. Pulitzer comes along in 1955 and 63. His famous novels are The Sound and Fury, As I Lay Dying, Light in August, Absalom, Absalom, and The Rivers. All of these deal with Southern plots. I mean, Southern lives and Southern families. All of these deal with. I mean, The Sound and Fury, of course, is the most famous of them. It deals with incest. It deals with insanity. It deals with the notion of identity, of what a family should be. The idea of dysfunctional family becomes very, very important in The Sound and Fury. As I Lay Dying, it talks about a journey where a family actually relocates themselves from one place of Southern America to another place, and half of the family members die within that journey. It's something like that. Absalom, Absalom is again a very famous, novel which talks about death. It talks about erosion of values. It talks about also the kind of developmental discrepancy between Northern America and Southern America. Southern America never faced that kind of development that Northern America did. Southern America has always been more agricultural. It has been the hub of cotton industry and stuff. So that becomes important in his. I mean, the pain of relocation, of going to Northern America, the dream to be a part of that American sentiment, that becomes very important in his novels as well. Snope trilogy, not very famous, but it might be important for your MCQ again. The Hamlet, the town, the mansion, it depicts the town called Jefferson. I mean, there is a town called Jefferson that it talks about, and how people go about running their own lives in the Southern America. So it's not very important as such from the literary point of view, but for your MCQ it might be important. He also deals with stream of consciousness. So he actually employs stream of consciousness very bravely. If you read Faulkner, you will see that stream of consciousness becomes a very dominant tool in his writings. His most important short story collection is called These 13. Important stories might be Rose for Emily, Red Leaves, That Evening Sun. They are important, but they have never been, given that kind of academic attention. So, but just remember the names if you don't go into the details. Might just help you with one question or so. Yeah. Next, we go to Henry Miller, a very confessional writer, wrote autobiographical novels specifically. Again, comes from the stream of consciousness type. Surrealist in different ways. His writings have free association, mysticism, metaphors. I mean, I haven't mentioned it, but he has extended metaphors. I mean, whenever you use extended metaphors, there is always a side of abstraction that comes in between. He writes novels like Tropic of Cancer, Black Spring, Tropic of Capricorn, The Rosy Crucifixion, the trilogy of Sextus, Dextus, and Nexus. What is important is all his novels that I've mentioned over here had been banned. Initially, all of them had been banned. He deals with explicit sexual content. There is not much in his novels as such. He deals with human lives. I mean, again, the American dream is a perpetual theme, but he deals with how sex becomes a very important way to kind of compensate for the economic success that you do not get. Sexual pleasure, sexual dominance, all of that becomes very important in his novels. Sadism, masochism, all of that is mentioned, and his crude language, his crude, kind of elucidation on the sexual dimension of life actually made all of his novels go ban, be banned after a certain point of time. Um, uh, it is said that he played a very significant role in the sexual revolution of 1960 and 1980. Sexual revolution was a movement as such. It has nothing to do with literature. It is a cultural movement. But it was a movement where people were questioning monogamous relationships. They were questioning heterosexuality. They were questioning, let's say, puritanical views on not talking about sex, Victorian views. So all of that was being dismantled with the onset of the postmodern era. So people say that Henry Miller's novels played an important cultural role in kind of establishing the sexual revolution of 1960 to 1980. Yeah. Next, we go to Norman Mailer. Again, Norman Mailer, you have to remember this thing. This might be very, very important for you. That is, he is the father of so-called explicit new journalistic prose. He writes fiction, but his fiction is more like, it's more like reportage. He writes, he writes in a way which you kind of encounter in newspapers and various journals that you come across. Other writers who actually collaborated with him was where Truman Capote, Joan Didon, Hunter S. Thompson, a very famous writer, Tom Wolfe. Norman Mailer actually wrote novels like The Naked and the Dead, Armies of the Night. Armies of the Night is a non-fiction novel. It's oxymoronic in a way. But Armies of the Night, if you go through that particular novel, you will feel like you are actually reading a reportage of a particular event that happened. I mean, I think it deals with the First World War again. Also, yeah, the First World War specifically, and it deals with how the reportage came along. The newspapers reported the events and almost mimics them from a satirical point of view. It is almost satirical, but you will also feel that you are reading a newspaper, which is a little comic in that sense. So that is important for you to remember. The Executioner's Song, again, it deals with the notion of the war, Second World War as well. That has been depicted in the Executioner's Song. It gets a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The Naked and the Dead, equally important. Also, I think he has written a lot of essays of them. I don't know, I haven't mentioned over here, but there is an essay called The White Negro. If you go through that essay, you might note it down. The White Negro, it's called. That actually essay looks at the hippie culture and says that what Negro and punk culture does to the mainstream culture in America, the formation of counter cultures in a way. The hipster culture, the hippie culture does the same thing to let's say people who believe in very, very conventional notions of dressing and behavioral ethics. So that becomes important. The White Negro is a significant essay that you might remember. I haven't mentioned over here. Yeah. Also, we come to the next slide. It talks about this writer called Saul Bellow. He's not very famous, but nevertheless, he's significant enough. In his novels, you find there is an inherent contradiction between civilizations, what American society stood for, what it became, how colonialism was a problematic venture. All of that is there in his writings. He's very particular about his Jewish identity. Specifically, he refers to the Nazi, let's say, Nazi treatment of the Jews. So that becomes also important in his writings, and he's highly elusive. He mentions Henry James and Proust, also employs stream of consciousness in many parts of his novels. He gets the Nobel Prize in 1976, Pulitzer also in the same year. He has received the National Book Award thrice, 1954, 65, 71. And his work includes important works include The Adventures of Augie March, Henderson the Dane, Humboldt's Cave, Revelstein, Seize the Day. Seize the Day is about again the American dream, working throughout the day and the night and coming home, without your ambitions being met. It's the same thing. The Adventures of Augie March is about a woman who actually goes out and meets humans. I mean, let's say man's society struggles to keep her feet together and succeeds at the end, which is important. Many actually novels or writings that deal with American life never show the protagonist succeeding. It's always about pessimism. Augie March succeeds, so that is one thing you might remember. Yeah. So Henderson the Rain, I mean, it's not that important. Doesn't, I mean, when we come to the content. But yeah, these are his more important writings. Sylvia Plath, very very famous poet. Most of you probably would know. Very very personal, very poignant and painful. If you read her autobiography, The Bell Jar, it's very very painful. She was suffering from a psychological issue. I mean, it was a psychotic disease, and Ted Hughes actually also paid a tribute to her later, but many people say Ted Hughes, I mean her husband, had a role in her psychological problem, but that is debatable again. Her main collection of poems is The Colossus and Other Poems, which comes out in the 1960s. There is Ariel that comes out in 1965, but most important is a novel, The Bell Jar. It's a fantastic novel. I mean, I would recommend it any day. It's a beautiful novel, but very very painful and poignant. So that might be important. It got the Pulitzer Prize, but she received it posthumously because Sylvia Plath, in fact, committed suicide. So she got it after she died. That might be important. Arthur Miller, a very famous dramatist. I think many of you are acquainted with his name. He also dealt with realism on the stage. Last of the best known American playwrights, his works include All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, A View from the Bridge. Death of a Salesman, of course, is the most popular work that he has written. It deals with a salesman's ambition, his family, problems in his family, the scope of actually reverting to a different profession, identity crisis. All of that is present in the Death of a Salesman. Again, the American dream. The Crucible, in fact, is a play that goes back to the witch trials at Salem. It deals with complete madness, complete superstition. He critiques it, of course, through his play, but that becomes very important. The Crucible. A View from the Bridge. All My Sons is also about identity, by the way. All My Sons is a very famous play. It deals with identities of a son and a daughter and how they become mistaken. So all these three plays are very important. A View from the Bridge is not that important, but anyway, it has found mention in many important critical texts. So yeah, look, that might be important. But I haven't gone through it, so I can't comment. Most noted screenplay is The Misfits. There is an entire play called The Misfits by Miller, and it has been adapted as a film as well. And it's a beautiful, play which talks about human identity and its struggle in conquering nature. Again, that particular theme. It deals with the Northwest frontier, the cowboy culture. All of that is very well represented, and it shows that human ambitions are at last defeated in the hands of nature. It actually posits that nature reigns supreme over human ambition, something like that. So that is important. And Arthur Miller, of course, he was also belonging to the left wing parties. Um, he donated his handwritten works to Harry Ransom Center, might be important for your MCQ. And the name of his biographer is Christopher Bixby, who wrote his biography based on the first-hand material which Arthur Miller donated to the Ransom Center. That might be important. Next, we move on to Tennessee Williams, again a very famous playwright. Almost Arthur Williams and Tennessee Williams, their names are taken in the same breath. He deals with realist modernism again. Streetcar Named Desire. People who have gone through it know it is about again the American dream. It's about the desire of acquiring more wealth. It's about let's say a breakdown of family values, of sexual turmoil, all of that. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is a very prominent play. In fact, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof actually also deals with the breakdown of human emotions and the neurosis that comes from along with the fall of American dream of being rich and being successful. Even being rich is a very relative term. You might have a material acquisition, but you might not be subjectively successful. So that is something which has been explored in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof as well. Sweet Bird of Youth, The Night of Ugana, more or less on the same similar themes. He died consuming Seconal, which is of course a drug that prevents insomnia, and it is said that he took excess of it. So might be important. His death is a little, deviant in a way, so that might be important for your information. Edward Albee, a very famous American playwright and probably the only playwright who has been called absurdist. I mean, of course, most of us know about Beckett and all, Irish literary theatre and British theatre. We talk about Samuel Beckett, but Edward Albee is probably the only American theatre artist, I mean, theatre playwright who has been called to be an absurdist. He got Pulitzer Prize for his drama Thrice, The Zoo Story, Sandbox, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, the Zoo Story is a remarkable play where there are two characters who sit together. There is one character who is actually very happy with his life. There is another character who says that he has visited the zoo and he's impoverished and he's not happy with his life. He dares the sane character to kind of kill him, which he doesn't, and there is a moment of competition for space on the bench. So the space on the bench is a microcosmic representation of American society, the macrocosmic American society. And at last, he himself actually, I mean, the character who actually is suffering, he gives his knife to the same character, and he stabs himself with that same knife. So it's an act of suicide, which might pass on for an act of murder because it was in the hands of the same person. So it is about absurdity, but it was completely absurd in a certain way. If you go through the play, it is absurd, as absurd as Waiting for Godot. So it is kind of that. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is a very, very famous play, and you might have questions from here. It's a play that deals with role playing. It talks about a couple which doesn't have children, who is trying to beget children and is suffering neurosis. There are guests who come over to their place, and there is complete confusion. There are mistaken identities. The woman, I mean the mother character, she dreams of having a child which she never gets. All of that. So all these neurosis, family values, all of that is present in Edward Albee's absurdist theatre. But Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf has been very widely acclaimed. It has even, I think, it has got the Pulitzer Prize as well. So it has been well acclaimed. Three Tall Women. It talks about women and how they look at life from a more absurdist point of view, in the sense that they want to sever relationships with men, and they think about a world which doesn't really have animate beings. It might have a little bit of echo of the of that post-human culture as such. So that might be present. Not a very significant play, but nevertheless important. Since we are not dealing with Harlem Renaissance, we don't have that much time. I've just kept it short. Harlem Renaissance happens in the age 1925 to 1940. Movement by the African American writers. You have to keep this in mind. It's a movement, cultural movement by the African American writers. It takes place in Harlem, of course, near Manhattan. It starts with the New Negro. It's a collection of writings, poems, and non-fiction writing by Alan Locke. You might be acquainted with his name. There is this role of NAACP, which is the Association for Colored People and their progress. The Garveyite movement. There was a movement which had been started by someone called Garvey. I mean, I forgot his first name. It was Harry Garvey or someone. I don't remember his first name. He actually talked about African Americans going back to the African continent and settling down. He was against settling in America. So that also drew huge crowds. As I said, the Great Migration, many people were going back to Africa and settling, and many people around in America, the African Americans, they were coming into Harlem and settling down. So both types, immigration and emigration, both were taking place. Anti-Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow laws were segregation laws in specifically in Southern America, where equal rights were not being bestowed on the African Americans and people of color. So that becomes important for us to remember. Harlem, in fact, becomes they say it's the Makkah of the cultural renaissance among the African Americans. So that is important. The journal which is associated with it is called Opportunity, a Journal of Negro Life. That is the first journal that comes up in support of Harlem Renaissance or support of the black writers. The important writers, which you might just look up in short, most of them are poets. There is not much to read, but you might just look up once. Are Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Claude Mackay, James Waldo Johnson, John Toomer. John Toomer has a very, very important poem. I think there is one single writing. It's not just a poem, it's an amorphous body of writing called the Cane, C-A-N-E, Cane. And if you go through it, you will find poetic passages, there are prose passages, all deal, inexorably with African American life in America. It's like that. So I mean, it doesn't have an agenda or a satirical or a critical purpose. It is just about a very, very realist plain depiction of African American life. I mean, the sense of expression is being generated through John Toomer's writing. Sterling Brown, Helen Johnson, and Spencer Richard Wright. I mean, all these writers are very important. If you consider the Harlem Renaissance, you might get one or two questions probably. I mean, for net you do get one or two questions. So you might just look up. There are more mainly they're poets. So you just go through three or four poems. Look up on the net which are the most important poems, and just go through them once. Uh, Other modern female writers, I think this is the last slide that I have. Yeah. Other modern female writers, which you might look up because this remains untouched still, is of course Alice Walker. I hope you have heard about her novel called The Color Purple. It's a beautiful novel. It talks about again identity crisis and the slave practice, the kind of treatment that was meted out to the colored people by the whites. There are other novels also called The Temple of My Fantasies, also Possessing the Secret of Joy. These are two novels which have come out recently. And Possessing the Secret of Joy is a very curious novel. I mean, it talks about a female, I forgot her name, of course, the protagonist, but she is a person who lives in, the Northern America, and she is very free and independent. She marries someone who actually is from a fictional town, which is shown to practice female mutilation still in America. But that is a fictional town, by the way. And she, being independent, she wants to return and face female mutilation just to reconnect with her roots. So that's a very curious novel in a way. So you might just look that up. It's called Possessing the Secret of Joy. Other writers are Angela Davis, of course. She is mostly a non-fiction writer. Women, Race, and Class, Blue Legacies, and Black Feminism. These are the kind of writings that come out from her. Adrienne Rich, again, she has written a lot of poetry. Not very famous, but very critical in different ways. She is a part of the feminist movement, the Creature Feminine movement. So her famous poetry collections include the Diamond Cutters and the Will to Change. I think these are the two most famous poetry collections that come up. Um Toni Morrison, I think many of you might have heard her name. Beloved, a a very, very beautiful novel. It deals with slavery, it deals with psychosis, it deals with the pains of being a mother, slave trade, everything has been depicted very vividly. The Bluest Tide, same thing. There's a character called Piccola, I remember, and it deals with how uh, women, like black women, were impregnated by American white men, and they had to bear the brunt of of course, the rape culture and segregation with the children. So that is something which might be important. Other novel which is also important for Toni Morrison is Song of Solomon. You might just look up once. There is Zol Neale Hudson, of course. Her famous novel is Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a novel which deals with a woman actually marrying several times. This is a very progressive, I mean, a radical novel in a way. She marries several times, and all her husbands die one after the other till she finds the right person for her. So this is a remarkable novel by Zola Neale Hudson. You might just look that up. Lauren Hunsbury is probably a playwright. She's mainly a playwright. The only famous play that has attracted academic attention is called A Raisin in the Sun. Of course, the title of the play, A Raisin in the Sun, has been borrowed from a particular poem of Langston Hughes. I think the poem is called Dreams Deferred. Yeah, there is this line called "How is a dream deferred like a raisin in the sun?" So she borrows her title from there. It's a remarkable play. Again, it deals with black identities, not specifically female identities, but black identities in a mostly dominant white neighborhood. So these are some names that you might just note and look up, very briefly. Not very important or something thorough reading will be required right now, but you might just look up. These might be important for your examination. So yeah, more or less, I think I've covered American post. Yeah. If you have doubts or if you have comments to make, please free feel to talk. Hello, am I audible? Yeah. So if someone has a question or something, you might just ask or a comment to make. Yeah. Any observations that you want to share? Yeah, Maitri, right. So one thing that you can look up, I don't know if it is available. Uh, I have a photocopy actually. It's a very, very good book. It's by Penguin Classics. It is the ninth volume of the Penguin Classics. It only deals with American literature. I mean, I'm just recommending that book. I don't know if it's in the market right now, but if you get that book, just photocopy it. It's very difficult to buy it. It's very important for your NET examination. I mean, when I applied, I mean, I sat for my examination, I found a lot of questions from that particular book. It has a very thorough reading. You might just get helped. It's from the Penguin Classics, the ninth volume, called History of American Literature. Any other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do we get more questions from American literary history and religion as compared to the important writers and poets?
See, the point is, I think American literature is, the questions that come, they are not as thorough as, as that of British literature. That is true. But there are important poets, I mean, important writers which you should know, right? For your examination, someone like Fitzgerald or Hemingway or even for Arthur Miller, these are writers which you need to know. Baki, I mean, rest whoever whatever kind of writers you have, the most more insignificant ones, those might be helpful for your NET examination. I'm not very sure that for JNU they'll be asking you those kind of intricate questions, but I think the major writers you need to know. At least remember the publication history of their texts, the kind of writings they do, because it becomes really difficult to remember every plot. Going through Wikipedia and memorizing is a tedious job, it's a banal job. But what you can do is, if you remember what kind of themes occur in each writer's writing history, though themes are quite repetitive in American literature, you might just be able to kind of allow your guesswork to get make you more successful. So that is one thing that I did for my NET examination, so that might be helpful. Try to know the themes that are important for a writer, and if you see there is a similarity in themes, then try to know the essence of their writing, the style of their writing. That would actually help you to understand who can write what. I mean, the guesswork is an important thing, of course, especially if you have negative marking. Any further comments, questions, observations? Well, I'm sorry I had to go a little fast. I know I spoke a little fast because there was a lot to cover. So I hope you people could follow it. I mean, was it understandable or did I go really very fast? Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. Another thing, whoever is here from ISA, I will just request you because today's session was actually about American and Indian, but I understood it's virtually impossible to take both together. I will speak to Madhurima as well. If we get another day later, after 6th or on the 5th, I think 5th is a free day. I probably can do Indian if I get another day because today it was really impossible to take both the both American and Indian. So it's just a request. Yeah. Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining the call.